Ever wished deploying a SharePoint Framework app across multiple clients felt less like fighting a Hydra? If authentication errors, token confusion, and data permissions keep turning quick projects into tech support marathons, you're not imagining it. Multi-tenant SPFX really is that tricky. Stay tuned as we break down the real authentication headaches you'll face and, more importantly, the practical steps that actually work. Want to avoid last-minute emergencies next time a client says, "Can you make it work in our tenant too?" This is the video you've been looking for. Why multi-tenant SPFX feels like playing on hard mode. If you've spent any amount of time developing SharePoint Framework apps, you already know the story. You spend days perfecting a slick web part in your developer tenant. Every test passes, it looks great. Then you try to deploy that same SPFX app to a client tenant and things just break. No warning, no helpful error messages. Maybe the authentication flow suddenly reroutes users in circles. Maybe a graph call you relied on for core data comes up empty despite working perfectly yesterday. Or the app is there in App Catalog, but users don't see it in their site at all. If you're nodding along, you're not alone. Let's talk about what this actually looks like from a workflow point of view. You start by scaffolding your SPFX solution in your favorite developer tenant, typically the sandbox Microsoft gives you when you sign up for 365 developer programs. There, you register your Azure AD app, wire up permissions, and get all that neat consent flow running. You might hard code a few URLs, register your graph permissions, maybe even wire in some web part properties that pull config for your own site structure. You run local workbench, everything is green, and deployment to your own tenant feels like handing in a clean assignment. Then the opportunity or challenge comes to make this web part available for a client. Maybe it's for a partner organization, a customer's SharePoint Online, or another business unit that operates in an entirely different Office 365 environment. Suddenly the friction shows up. As soon as another organization tries to use the app, little pieces start to fall apart. The most common pain points are always the same. Authentication bugs you can't reproduce, permissions you thought you had but don't, and mysterious empty data issues from Microsoft Graph. I remember hearing from a developer who spent an entire afternoon tracking down why a people directory web part stopped returning results when deployed to a client's tenant. No error, just a blank interface. They retraced every step, recreated every Azure AD permission, checked app registrations, and only at the end realized that the client's admin hadn't granted consent to the graph permissions. Half a day wasted to hunt down a step Microsoft's documentation barely mentions. That headache isn't rare. Multi-tenancy shifts the playing field. Your code is no longer running in a single tightly controlled Azure Active Directory. Each tenant has its own AD, its own group policies, users, security settings, and critically, its own worldview of what permissions your app receives. Add to this the chaos of different site architectures. Clients might have hundreds of site collections with naming conventions that don't line up at all with what you assumed. Suddenly, those little details you baked into the first build, like hard-coded SharePoint URLs, tenant-specific site IDs, or even fixed logo files, start throwing invisible errors that only surface when users can't see the web part where they expect it. App registrations layer in their own issues. In a single tenant setup, the authentication handshake feels almost effortless. One app registration, one consent, clear flow. Move to a client environment, and you're often forced to convert that app registration to multi-tenant, wrangle admin consent for every new org, and make sure nothing is scoped to only your home directory. If you missed that, there's no obvious error telling you what's wrong. The failure is silent, and all you see is that your app just doesn't work elsewhere. And the fun part, Microsoft's documentation doesn't really flag these traps. Most guides walk through how to deploy in your tenant with a polite footnote buried somewhere about additional consent may be required for external tenants. That's a nice way of saying this is about to get complicated, but it doesn't prepare you for the hours spent rereading Azure AD portal documentation and checking which permissions were missed. Once you start deploying SPFX apps for actual clients, those "why does it work here but not there" moments stop being funny. They become the growing pains of building for real-world enterprise environments where your assumptions about permissions, URLs, or even simple things like user display name conventions get tested hard. You'll almost always find something you didn't predict, and the lesson gets learned the hard way. And if you've hit that wall more than once, It's not because you're unlucky. It's baked right into how Microsoft 365 was designed. Multi-tenant means different security boundaries by default. There's no magic make this work everywhere checkbox in the wizard. You have to intentionally build for it at every step, from Azure AD through SPFX deployment and the way you code your web parts. That rite of passage, the "it worked on my dev tenant" moment, is something every developer runs into when they ship SPFX solutions out of their own environment. So next time you find yourself wrangling an SPFX app that tanks the moment it leaves your safe test tenant, remember, it's not just you. Multi-tenant complexity is inherently part of the game. But the good news is some of the ugliest pitfalls are predictable. And with the right troubleshooting checklist, most can be avoided altogether. There are patterns and tools you can use to dodge the worst traps if you know where things actually break under the hood. Let's look at the authentication corner first, because for most people, that's where the pain really starts. The 3 authentication mistakes that tank your app and how to dodge them. If you've ever thought authentication is just part of the boilerplate, that mindset is exactly where most multi-tenant SPFX apps start to crack. Authentication inside SPFX can feel like an extra hoop, but with multi-tenant deployments, it's more like a minefield. The real issue, SPFX authentication isn't just one thing. It's a negotiation between SharePoint permissions, which are specific to content and what your app can do within a site, and Azure AD consent, which controls what external data or APIs your app gets to touch. If you treat it as a one-and-done checkbox, you're signing up for weeks of chasing invisible bugs. In a single-tenant setup, things almost lull you into a sense of security. You register your Azure AD app for just your directory, set your permissions, and run through the consent flow once. SharePoint permissions sync up with the AD app, and data access goes off without a hitch. But as soon as you try to scale your app into another organization that works on my machine, confidence evaporates. Multi-tenant means your app registration needs to support multiple directories, not just yours. Every tenant you deploy into becomes a brand new world with its own identity provider, consent process, and set of admins, most of whom have never seen your app before today. There are 3 classic mistakes developers run into with authentication in this setup, and each one has the power to quietly break your entire deployment. The first and most fundamental is choosing the wrong Azure AD app registration type. It's easy to skip past that little drop-down and leave your app as single tenant, which makes sense in your dev tenant, but instantly blocks access for any client. Only a multi-tenant app registration lets external organizations grant the permissions your app needs. Overlook this, and your login flow might look fine on your side. But users in a client tenant will get unexplained access errors or endless redirect loops. Mistake number 2 is assuming you only need to collect admin consent once. Even when your app registration is set correctly, every client tenant still has to approve the permissions your app requests, especially for anything touching Microsoft Graph. If a client's Azure admin hasn't approved the right scopes, your app doesn't fail with a clear message. Instead, Graph calls just return empty data, or features that rely on user profile info quietly disappear from the interface. There's no helpful dialogue, no red banner, just functionality that looks broken or non-existent. I've watched teams spin their wheels for days troubleshooting this, blaming code or deployment steps, when the entire holdup was waiting for admin consent in the external tenant. One developer told me about a people directory web part that looked great during demos, but was completely empty at the client's site. Users thought the app was broken, but the culprit was missing graph consent on the other side. Debugging that from a different tenant, not an experience anyone wants to repeat. The third trap is storing secrets or tenant-specific configuration inside the code or web part properties. This one happens more often than you'd think because it feels easy. Paste URLs, tokens, or app IDs right into the project properties or config files before packaging. But once that app goes live in a client tenant, you're suddenly managing sensitive data in dozens of deployments, forcing you to rebuild and redeploy the app every time a config changes. Worse, you risk leaking secrets or giving one client access to the wrong resources. For apps scaling to multiple tenants, this isn't just a tactical headache, it's a major security and compliance risk. Beyond that, it traps you in the maintenance grind. Each tenant needs their own version, and support calls start to pile up. The pattern underneath all these issues is the silent failure. Unlike traditional bugs that produce stack traces or error alerts, most authentication mistakes in SPFX just cause blank pages, missing data, or UI elements that stubbornly refuse to appear. The logs don't shout, "Here's your problem." Instead, your users are left wondering if they did something wrong, and you, the developer, are left searching for clues that barely exist. Troubleshooting authentication across tenants is less like debugging and more like detective work, checking admin centers, reviewing app registrations for multi-tenant support, and sending emails to whoever manages Azure consent in each client organization. There are better ways to approach all this, thankfully. A tenant-aware configuration system where app IDs, URLs, and required scopes are loaded from secure sources like Azure Key Vault or environment variables keeps sensitive values out of your solution package. It also allows each client tenant to set their own values at runtime without rebuilding the app. Encouraging a robust admin consent flow supported by clear user education, ideally with a setup guide or even an automated admin consent banner, shortens the feedback loop when scopes are missing. Finally, your app should check permissions at runtime, gracefully flagging missing consent so you and your users aren't left guessing, why isn't this working? If you take the time to head off these authentication traps up front, the rest of your multi-tenant headaches start to shrink. Most it just doesn't work moments come down to these three mistakes, and changing your deployment habits to avoid them turns unpredictable rollouts into something much closer to reliable. But even if you solve authentication, another problem lurks behind those blank screens. The real battle is with Microsoft Graph and how your app handles data in wildly different environments. Let's talk about how data access breaks next and what you can actually do about it. Graph integration, why your data disappears, and how to get it back. If you've ever run an SPFX solution and watched Microsoft Graph hand you a handful of empty data, you know the frustration. There's no error message, no polite warning, just a quiet failure where you expected actual user info, group lists, or calendar events. It's one of those quirks everyone runs into working with multi-tenant SharePoint Framework projects, and it has less to do with your code than you might think. Let's break down how these calls to Graph even happen inside SPFX. When you build a web part that needs to tap into Microsoft 365 data, maybe surface a list of people, read calendar invites, or show Teams messages, you're usually using the MS Graph client or AD HTTP client. SPFX tries to smooth things over by abstracting away some of the authentication, and under the hood, it relies on delegated or app permissions. Delegated permissions run as the signed-in user and inherit their rights. App permissions act on behalf of the application, often elevated, and don't care who's using the app right now. Out of the box, SPFX is wired for delegated permissions because everything it does is scoped to the current user's context. App permissions can be possible in specific setups, but come with their own friction and require special approvals. So if you're fetching users or pulling files, you're mostly living with delegated permissions, meaning your app is only as powerful as whoever is logged in and what they're allowed to see. Where does it trip people up? You run the app in your own tenant, logged in as a global admin or test account you control. Every Graph call fires successfully. You spin up a new site in a client's tenant, repeat the same actions, and suddenly the results are empty. Sometimes you get a silent fallback, no errors, just nothing returned. Other times features seem to work for your account, but for nobody else. It's a classic scenario. The key works perfectly in your own lock, but once you move to a new tenant, the door simply refuses to open, same key, different lock. In the context of SPFX, the Graph API itself hasn't changed. What's different are the permissions, consent, and identity boundaries every tenant brings along. Here's where it gets even trickier. Each client tenant must explicitly grant consent for your Azure AD app to access Microsoft Graph on their behalf. Just because your app has the right permissions in your own directory doesn't mean those carry forward anywhere else. The admin in tenant B needs to log in, see a clear consent prompt, and approve every Graph scope your app requests. If they skip the consent process or only grant it to a subset of users, your web parts might still appear, but the data will be a ghost town. This is one step that's alarmingly easy to miss, partly because Microsoft's onboarding workflows actually allow SPFX web parts to show up before consent is granted. That means users can install and launch your app and see absolutely nothing without a clue why it's empty. On top of the permission and consent labyrinth, there's the complexity of site architecture. SharePoint environments rarely look the same across clients. One tenant might organize everything in a handful of modern site collections with predictable URLs, while another has migrated decades of legacy SharePoint content into tangled subsite hierarchies. Properties like site IDs, group memberships, and even basic pathing can all be different. User profiles don't always include the expected custom fields, and group naming conventions can be so wildly inconsistent that even a well-formed graph query yields no matches. Your app might be looking for HR group, but the client calls it people operations, or maybe they nest critical users inside subgroups you didn't plan for. Suddenly, not only are your graph calls failing on permissions, they're misfiring because the environment structure wasn't what you assumed. Consider this. A dev builds an employee directory web part, confident it's bulletproof. It pulls users from graph, shows photos, departments, and job titles, deploys to production for a client. The page loads, but the directory is empty. Later, it turns out the client tenant hasn't granted consent for the correct graph scopes. On top of that, the SharePoint default site isn't a site's HR anymore. It's moved, and the logic filtering users by department refers to an old metadata field. Troubleshooting feels like peeling back layers, looking for which setting is out of sync across tenants. So what do you do to avoid this headache? The first step is to never assume graph calls will just work outside your dev environment. Always test them with tools like Graph Explorer or Postman using real accounts from the target tenant. These tools let you simulate the user experience. If the response is empty or permission is denied, you catch the failure before rolling out to a crowd. Better yet, use demo tenants that reflect client environments. Microsoft offers these through their 365 test labs. And you can set up users, groups, and data structures to mimic real production quirks. That means fewer SPFX updates against live client data just to chase down why people aren't showing up in the directory web part. Once you've seen firsthand how graph scopes and tenant consent are intertwined, things start making sense. The blank data isn't a bug in your code. It's often a missing yes from the admin or a logic gap because the environment doesn't match your assumptions. Handle that, and your data experience gets reliably consistent. No more empty screens in one tenant and perfect results in another. Now you've got authentication patterns dialed in and your graph data showing up where it should. The last barrier, actually managing your SPFX deployments at scale so you're not stuck patching 5 different versions for 5 different clients. Let's get into what it really takes to support SPFX apps across the wild jungle of client tenants. Scaling and supporting SPFX solutions across client tenants without the nightmares. So you've cleaned up authentication and managed to get graph data showing up for everyone. Now comes the real grind, maintaining these SPFX apps once they're actually in use across a handful or a crowd of client tenants. The early excitement of launch tends to fade when you realize every client has their own flavor of SharePoint, their own security quirks, and their own timeline for updates. Most developers find out quickly that even small tweaks, like a new field in a user profile or a branding change, can turn into a nightmare if you don't have a plan for scale. Let's get into what actually happens. Packaging, updating, and debugging SPFX solutions sounds pretty standard on paper, but the moment you're dealing with client number 3, reality shifts. Each organization has carved their own SharePoint landscape, different site collections, policy settings, branding, and even custom scripts already in place. Some might have tight lockdowns where you're waiting days for your app package to get through security scans. Others will greenlight everything in one step, then come calling when a web part doesn't match their site logo or font. And if you've still got any manual steps in your deployment pipeline, the chance of missing something simple like updating a manifest or toggling a feature flag goes way up. Here's where the pain sets in. Manual deployments and tenant-specific builds age poorly fast. Imagine patching a bug. You think it's one quick fix, but then multiply that by 5 tenants. Suddenly, you're juggling custom builds, digging up which version is live where, and tracking down which customer is missing last week's hotfix. Each update that's not fully automated sneaks in more maintenance debt. Over time, the small stuff adds up, especially when clients ping you on Friday afternoon with, "Can you just deploy that new feature before Monday?" Missing just one config update can ripple into user complaints, broken branding, or worst of all, silent failures you only find out about after a furious email chain. To cut down on this chaos, start by centralizing your packaging and deployment process. Package your SPFX solution once using a tenant-agnostic design so the core logic doesn't care which SharePoint tenant it runs inside. Avoid baking in tenant-specific branding or config. Instead, lean on tenant-scoped deployment options. This lets you push the same package out to each client tenant while letting them manage local settings like site URLs, colors, or contact links through configuration panes or secure app settings. Some teams even go a step further and publish their SPFX packages to a private NPM registry or Azure blob, giving managed partners a single source of truth for updates. Building tenant-agnostic web parts means relying less on hard-coded values and more on environment variables or dynamic discovery. For branding, use SharePoint's theme APIs to automatically match the web part to the current site. If you need to pull specific config, consider a settings list stored in the client's own SharePoint or a simple API endpoint that reads from a secure store. The payoff: you're not rebuilding your app every time a client updates their HR portal theme. Another often overlooked area: centralized logging and monitoring. Supporting multiple tenants without line of sight into failures is a recipe for mystery bugs. If your app logs errors to a central dashboard, whether that's Application Insights, Azure Monitor, or even a custom webhook, you can spot issues before a client raises a ticket. You see exactly which tenant, which web part, and sometimes which user hit an error. That context is a lifesaver when a new SharePoint feature rollout triggers unexpected issues across dozens of clients. You'll know whether it's a tenant misconfiguration, an expired app secret, or a new permission prompt that's breaking things. Security matters a lot here, especially for config. Hard-coding tenant details, secrets, or tokens is a serious risk. One leaked package and suddenly every client shares the same exposure. Instead, use Azure Key Vault for storing secrets, drop environment variables into the deployment pipeline, or support per tenant app settings managed through the SharePoint UI. That way, sensitive data is changed without touching the solution package or redeploying the full app. Updates become much lower friction, and your clients' security teams sleep a bit easier. If you look at how managed service providers operate, you'll spot a few common patterns: centralized update pipelines, routine automated health checks, and self-service config portals where clients can tweak non-sensitive settings. When one client pushes for a new feature, the provider rolls it out everywhere in a single pass. But the magic is in how they isolate tenant data, ensuring one client's settings or mistakes can't impact another. They log everything centrally, watch for common points of failure, and set up alerting so bad graph response rates or failed logins surface right away, not days later. All these strategies add up to a much more predictable experience. Instead of bracing for the weekend after every update, you start to trust your SPFX deployments. Even when the SharePoint ecosystem throws a curveball your way. It doesn't mean the complexity is gone, but suddenly you're handling it instead of drowning in it. And here's the underrated bonus: clients notice the difference. Apps that stay up to date and match their branding without endless support tickets build real trust and set your work apart. If the idea of supporting multi-tenant SPFX still feels daunting, remember, the problems aren't unique and neither are the solutions. The real difference is building with scale in mind from day one, not after that revenue pipeline is already full. And while you'll still get that Friday emergency request, chances are you'll have it patched before you finish your coffee because your strategy was ready before the call even came in. Now, after everything we've covered, one thing becomes clear. Nobody actually solves multi-tenant SPFX alone, and you don't have to either. If multi-tenant SPFX has you double-checking every step and second-guessing your logic, you're not the only one. Each hiccup is a sign you're working on real business challenges at a scale that actually matters. So the next time a client asks if you can bring that app to their tenant, you'll know the common traps. They're predictable and, more importantly, fixable. Build once, support many, and keep security at the center. The more reusable and secure your apps become, the more headspace you earn for business problems that move the needle instead of getting tangled in troubleshooting.